I hope you've been doing well out there. It's definitely been a minute. I'm freshly back from my guide training in California, and today's video is going to be a discussion on the four kind of major roles relating to psychedelic journey work. That would be sitters, guides, therapists, and shamans, what the differences between the four roles are, what the commonalities and overlaps are between them, so that you have a better understanding of kind of what each of these are, and perhaps what might suit you best depending on your needs. So let's talk about it. So let me just set up a little bit of context and introduction here before we go ahead and get into the four major roles. So if I'm going to be transparent with you guys, this is one of these topics that I've been intending to talk about for probably 6 months or so at this point. It's just been there on the video to-do list. But if I'm going to be honest with you, I'd struggled a little bit with being clear about what a guide is exactly. I understood really clearly what a psychedelic therapist is, what a shaman is, what a sitter is, but this role of being a guide has been a little bit fuzzy in my head, and therefore I haven't made the video yet because I wasn't clear about it and I didn't want to talk about something that I didn't clearly understand. So fast forward to my recent journey to California, where I attended a training for underground guides to learn more about what exactly guide work is. And sure enough, the first thing we talked about was what the role of the guide is, what that looks like, what the responsibilities are, what the requirements are, and how the guide engages with the journeyer and how that's different, but also overlapped with these other roles. So we are going to be talking about this today, and hopefully you'll have a much better understanding. And therefore, depending on what your needs are, whether you're someone who just wants to explore psychedelics for your own kind of self-inquiry, spiritual exploration kind of process, you're someone who clearly has, therapeutic need where you need healing, you're somebody who wants to connect more with a kind of indigenous traditional use of psychedelics, et cetera, you'll understand more perhaps who you want to be looking for, who you want to be reaching out to, what domain and what types of people might be more well suited to your needs. So let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so I think probably the easiest way to start to understand each of these roles is to start with the extremes and kind of define those clearly. And then that'll kind of help us to understand perhaps some of the more ambiguous places in between, and we can start to get a sense of how these all fit together. So I think one of the extremes, and of course this would be up for debate, and some people may not agree with me here, I think one of the clear extremes of this spectrum of roles in psychedelics would be a psychedelic therapist. And, since obviously a lot of people who are new to psychedelics and interested in them, and really the whole psychedelic renaissance as we currently know it is hinging around this role and this burgeoning industry really of psychedelic therapy, let's define that really clearly first so that you know exactly what it means to go see a psychedelic therapist, right? So obviously when you go to see a psychedelic therapist, first off, if you're in the US like I am here, all of them, except for the ones working in ketamine in legal clinics, are still going to be underground, right? By definition right now, even if they're getting trained by MAPS or going to one of the colleges and educations that are kind of set up to, support people in learning how to do this skill set, by definition, psychedelic therapists are going to be underground because all psychedelic substances are federally illegal currently at this time, except for, of course, ketamine, which is, there's DEA licensure around, and it's a whole thing, right? So first things first, probably this is going to be a legit therapist who is properly, schooled and trained and licensed in psychotherapy, or a psychiatrist who is similarly, properly trained and working as a psychiatrist who also happens to have an underground interest or passion or skill set with psychedelics. Generally, obviously, when you go to these people, they are going to bring both the strengths and the weaknesses of being a therapist into the context, right? So when you go work with them, for example, there is going to be clearly a very psychological lens to how they look at and view, the work that you're doing together, how they view your issues, and really how the whole thing, is kind of framed and understood and related to. So it's going to be, mental, it's going to be emotional, it's going to be about probably your past and cleaning up and resolving stuff that in the past, that might need resolving. It's going to be about potentially trauma. It's going to be about working out mental, emotional issues, let's say. There are a lot of different ways that psychedelic therapists go about doing the work. There's really a wide spectrum right now. It's not well defined. It's still very much kind of Wild West energy out there in terms of figuring it out, right? So there are some psychedelic therapists who don't really work with you when you're on the medicine. So they will do a bunch of work with you beforehand, kind of work through a bunch of therapeutic material, set you up for a journey, sit with you in the journey, but essentially be non-directive or non-interventionist during the psychedelic experience itself with you, hold space with you, support you and kind of re-entry back into your normal state of consciousness, perhaps do some integration work with you, kind of work with you on the material in therapy afterwards, and then kind of rinse and repeat this loop of kind of doing therapy and then doing journeys and then doing more therapy, then doing more journeys. That's a very common approach. Another approach for psychedelic therapy, is that some therapists are actually working with you while you're on the medicine. So it's more interactive, more directive. And there's tons of different modalities that are being applied in this way. So there's a wide, array of approaches to doing the actual psychedelic therapy, from literally doing therapy on psychedelics to using psychedelics as almost like the microscope for the mind kind of metaphor, where you're looking in at your progress or what might be some unconscious material and then using that in therapy to kind of progress forward. So this is one approach. Some of the downsides are that first of all, they may not be really very skilled with psychedelics. Okay, so a lot of psychedelic therapists are very new to psychedelic use, as in a few years of using them with themselves, a limited number of experiences themselves, maybe even new to receiving trainings. So a lot of times they don't have a lot of personal experience with the materials, these non-ordinary states to draw from to really relate to perhaps where you're at. They may tend to overemphasize pathology, because that's kind of an issue with psychotherapy in general, is kind of this pathological kind of orientation to things. They may, tend to, not understand how different non-ordinary states are, and, not really have a very strong skill set for working with non-ordinary states, because a lot of times traditional models of therapy, traditional models of just socializing or interacting or breaking, connecting, break down when you're, multiple grams deep on a psilocybin journey. It really rearranges everything to bring the medicine into the picture. So there's also issues, that therapists are highly attuned to, and this could be a plus or a minus in terms of transference. In other words, what you as a journeyer might project onto the therapist, or the other way around, countertransference, what they might project onto you. So all of this, can be, pluses or minuses depending on what you need from the experience. So psychedelic therapists are fantastic. I think they serve a really good role. I think a lot of times they have the better skill set for very precise psychological, emotional, trauma level healing. Psychedelic therapists often don't think a lot about perhaps the environment, the container, the space, the aesthetics of the music, the aesthetics of scent, of colors and visuals around you, these kinds of things that perhaps a guide or shaman might, leverage more, to your favor. So it's really about different approaches and different, different flavors here. I do think that for a lot of people, who are coming to psychedelics for healing, you probably want to go to a psychedelic therapist. That's probably what's going to get you the furthest. But I'd like to explain to you what a shaman does as a contrast to this at perhaps the other end of the spectrum. And then again, we can kind of fill in the other roles in the middle. Next up, let's talk about shamans. So full transparency here, this is an area that I have less experience with. I have sat in traditional ceremonies. I have been lucky enough to be in the presence of some really powerful shamans, but it's not something that I have a lot of experience with. It's not something I've logged years down in the jungle, working at. So this is something that I perhaps know a little bit less about. So if I get something wrong here, please, let me know, or, apologies ahead of time here. But this is just kind of my perception, my understanding of it. So I think one of the things that really distinguishes shamanism from all the other approaches is that it's really centered around healing work and energetic healing work in specific. So when you go to a shaman, they often take the medicine too with the journeyer to some degree, maybe not as much, but a little bit. And often they're working on your energy body directly with their shamanic technologies and tools. So this is a very different approach from thinking about the layer of the mind and the psyche. So with shamanism, it's very much about the spiritual first, and the worldview, the cosmology is fundamentally spiritual, not fundamentally psychological or emotional. Often shamans are working in a language, a whole palette of archetypes, right? So they may be through their songs, through the music, through their movements, through certain plants they have around, certain symbols on their altar or on their clothing, the way they've arranged the space that you're in, perhaps any of the animals in the space with you. They work with this language of life, of archetypes in life, to communicate and work with your deep psyche in a way that presents challenges, that presents healing, that presents new patterns of possibility for you that I think our deeper mind recognizes and resonates with. And often this is how a lot of the kind of interaction is done, let's say, as far as I understand it. Again, I could be totally wrong about that, but that's what I often see. Shamans are often very comfortable in non-ordinary states of consciousness. And so as a contrast to perhaps newer psychedelic therapists who are maybe very new to psychedelics, shamans are often very familiar with psychedelics, very familiar with altered states even outside of psychedelics, and very comfortable working in those states of consciousness. Shamans are really interesting in that generally the real deal ones are very rigorously trained over years and sometimes decades to build the skills that they have. And it's very intense training. It's not a joke at all. But there are also people out there working as shamans who perhaps aren't super well trained. And obviously, as far as I know, there's no, governing board or licensure board or anything like that to regulate how or even out the skill set of training of shamans. So you do get more of a spread of skills between different lineages, different schools, how hard people have gone with training and their background in order to be able to be that medicinal, leader in the medicine space. They often, shamanism is often, generally part of a traditional indigenous culture. This is really important to understand. So a lot of times when you're going to work with a shaman, you're not just having a psychedelic experience or even just a healing experience. You're having an experience of putting yourself inside the context of another culture and their cultural understandings, their view on life, their, deep epistemology of, of what life is, what being a human being is, and what healing is, that may be vastly different from the culture you grew up in or were born into. Now, obviously for a lot of us, that's appealing, that's exciting, that's beautiful, that's, poetic, or, these kinds of things. But also that can create for a lot of disconnect between what you mean when you say, I want a healing or I need a healing, and what's delivered, or what you encounter or what you experience. As part of these traditional cultures, and I think it's really important to understand and recognize that and respect them as such, a part of how I've seen a lot of this work done is that it's actually highly, highly organized and ordered. So shamanism is often, a lot of these kind of medicine spaces are filled with a lot of rules of how to behave, of where to sit, of what to do, of when to do it, of how to respond in certain situations, of how to receive the medicine, of how to receive the healing. There's a whole set of protocols that are part of this container. So in contrast to perhaps psychedelic therapy, where you're going and laying on a bed in a hospital or a therapist's office, and they're going to administer, psychedelics, and maybe there's eye shades, and you're just going inside and allowing yourself to have what experience you have, or perhaps you're working with the therapist in a more interactive way, but it's more clearly about you, your mental, emotional healing, and otherwise it's kind of open-ended. Excuse me. By contrast, a lot of times in a shamanic context, it's very, very structured. And, a metaphor that I heard recently that I liked was it can be, kind of like the captain of a ship taking the ship out to sea for a sail, right? And so there are rules, there are ways things are done, and it's being led in a very particular way by someone who knows how to sail the seas, so to speak. And you, as a journeyer, are just a passenger on the ship. That may or may not work for you. I think when it comes to, spiritual healing, when it comes to spiritual experience, when it comes to experiencing indigenous cultures and how work has been done for thousands of years, shamanism is really beautiful and powerful. Some of the kind of drawbacks to that approach, though, are that a lot of times shamans and these indigenous cultures don't have as equally sophisticated models of understanding the psyche, understanding the mind, the emotions, understanding trauma. They may not be trauma informed. They may not even have a word or concept for what trauma really is in the way that we understand it here in the West. They also may be a little more fuzzy when it comes to, ethics and ethical interactions and, things in terms of boundaries, stuff like that. So, choose wisely. And I would say in general, if you're going to open yourself up spiritually to someone who's going to guide you or teach you or heal you or work with you in a spiritual manner, that's such a deep and subtle level of our being, just as much as you want to choose your therapist wisely, I would say you'd also want to choose your shaman wisely and be really, really intentional about that and really wise about that. But that's kind of at the other end. So at one end, we kind of have this very intellectual, Western, modern, lots of models of understanding. At the other end, we have this very intuitive, altered states of consciousness, traditional. Both have a lot of order to them in different ways. And really serve different functions and work at different layers. So I think those are kind of two extremes. Well, let's talk about sitting and guide work and how they kind of fit inside this spectrum. Okay, let's talk about sitters. So this is an area that admittedly I don't know as much of the history about. I'm not sure if sitting is kind of a newer phenomenon that's kind of just emerged in tandem with the use of psychedelics over the last 50 years in kind of modern societies, or if this is something that's perhaps a little bit older, but just less known about, less talked about because it's simpler. I will say that often the power of a good sitter is deeply underestimated. And this is kind of the one that I think often goes under the radar in terms of value. But when you have a good sitter, it can really make a huge difference. It can be a really profound thing to have someone who simply holds a safe space for you and is there as a lifeline to kind of make sure that you're okay, that is there looking out for you, that allows you to kind of go deeper inside of yourself. Generally speaking, a sitter is going to be someone who is non-interactive, right? Who isn't going to allow you to get kind of caught up in big philosophical discussions about the things you're seeing. They're not necessarily going to, talk to you a lot or try to give you new experiences or do things. Generally, a sitter is going to be there to quietly be a presence of safety for you, to make sure that your basic needs are met, like you've got water coming if you need it, help you get safely, to the bathroom if you're having a hard time standing up. Things like, making sure that you don't hurt yourself, making sure that you don't break anything in the space you're in, making sure that you, obviously don't hurt anybody else, that you don't run screaming naked out the front door, things like this, right? They're ground control. They're just there to kind of hold space with you and kind of lovingly watch over you, make sure that you're okay. And and if you really get kind of on, swept up in like a distorted perception of reality, and you're kind of caught up in seeing something and it feels very emotionally relevant, but maybe from like an ordinary state of consciousness it might sound a little bit kooky or silly, or like you're kind of a crackpot or whatever. A lot of times when we're in those states, a good sitter might help us to talk through something and encourage us to stay present with our experience, rather than trying to negate our experience, talk us down, as they say, or try to kind of reality control us. So a good sitter will often honor our altered experience of reality, welcome the kind of expressions that come out of that, and work with us if we're feeling like we need contact, but generally going to kind of steer us back towards being present with our own internal experience, and just gracefully, lovingly holding space with us. So sitting, again, super valuable, profoundly helpful, to have someone who's not really there to get caught up in your thing, but is there just looking out for you. So that's kind of the role of a sitter. And I would use a sitter mostly if you're going to do home exploration, if it's about just general kind of being a psychonaut in terms of exploring your own mind, exploring your own emotions. Maybe there's a little bit of a therapeutic inquiry here, but it's not an explicitly therapeutic thing. You're kind of just wanting to go deep. You're wanting to explore psychedelics. You're wanting to make sure you're safe. This is where a sitter becomes really good. And a sitter could be a loved one. It could be a friend. It could be a partner or spouse. It could be a parent if you have that kind of relationship with your parents. It could be just a really good friend. It could even be a stranger if you trust them. The key here is that it's someone that you really trust, that you can allow yourself to trust to handle the logistics of someone knocking on the door, or, oh, you're really thirsty, you need water, or, et cetera, right? So that's, best use for a sitter. And I would recommend, if you've never had a sitter to watch over you, even if you're kind of experienced, I think it's a worthwhile experience to have someone who's sober, kind of looking out for you, watching over you, and taking care of you. So if you're new to psychedelics, I would definitely encourage you to start with having a sitter first. I do think there's value in eventually learning how to kind of transition into having solo journeys and feeling safe in your own skin enough to kind of go there and open up. But I think at first it's really, really helpful to kind of just have that friendly presence watching over us. Okay, and lastly, let's talk about guides here. So the role of the guide, like I said, is something that for me was something I kind of intuitively understood, but was a little ambiguous around until my recent training. And something that I think is often more misunderstood in the psychedelic space. So I wanted to try to address and clarify what exactly a guide is and does as best I can. The kind of full, caveat here, the obvious thing that you've probably already picked up from what I said in this video, is that guides are more ambiguous than these other roles because they tend to pull from all these other roles, right? So guides may have elements of how they work that, look and feel a lot like a shaman's approach. Or, a guide may have, may be a therapist, or may be trained in therapy or therapeutic skills. A guide might also do a lot of sitting and not be really interactive and kind of, be unplugged and just kind of watching over you, making sure you have a nice, safe container in which to have your experience. So there's a combination of all these roles, right? Generally speaking, guides may come from indigenous backgrounds, but often don't. They may be trained in energy or spiritual healing work, but again, they may not. They may be anything from a psychiatrist or a highly skilled licensed therapist to someone who knows nothing about therapy and psychology. They might be more interactive. A lot of times guides are more interactive. They might get in there. They might, with your consent, they might, give you a little body work and give you a shoulder massage. They might, work with you and encourage you to work with a certain breath pattern to open up your body. They might, lead you through a meditation. They might talk through something with you if you feel like you need that, but they also might not. A lot of guides tend to do kind of what we might call neo-shamanic work, where there's a lot of use of the environment, of creating a really nice container with an altar and with flowers and with nice aromas and scents like incense or scented candles or, Palo Santo or sage or something like that. A guide might, incorporate, music. They might kind of play, a custom playlist for you that they've developed, or lead you through an experience through perhaps like a guided journey of spoken word. So guides might be more interactive than, say, a sitter, or more interactive even than, say, a non-interventionist, therapist might be. But guides might also sit back and just kind of hold a safe space for you, create some ground rules like, please don't leave the house, we're going to keep it to this room, and kind of lay out like a nice structured situation for you to, kind of have your experience in. With guides, I think it's important to understand that this is a role we're going to see more and more of, as psychedelics become more popular. And there are going to be a lot of people who advertise themselves as guides. I already see a lot of it online, honestly. And this is going to be the widest spread of skills. From people who are honestly just some dude who took psychedelics for a couple years and, decided to christen himself a guide and represent himself this way and wants to administer the medicine to you. And maybe he's a decent sitter, but he really doesn't know anything about the nuances of the shamanic path or the nuances of being a good therapist or anything like that. And he's just kind of, there being your medicine bro, right? There are people like that out there who really don't have any training. There's also guides, like some of the people I, met and some of the people I know in the psychedelic underground that are deeply trained, that have been doing this work for decades, that know their shit inside and out, that understand non-ordinary states in a way that a lot of therapists don't, that, have perhaps, themselves participated in a lot of traditional medicine work in terms of maybe ayahuasca work or traditional mushroom or peyote work. A lot of guides are also cross-trained in other skills, other spiritual practices. A lot of them, understand therapy really well and, are studying and learning about therapeutic practices and know how to hold a space in a way that perhaps some of these, perhaps a sitter, for example, or perhaps a therapist may not. So the guide's, relationship where, like, let's say the therapist relationship is towards your psyche and towards therapy. The shaman's, orientation is much more towards the spiritual layer of your being, right? And spirit as a transpersonal force for healing. The guide's relationship is going to be much more towards your relationship with the medicine, right? How are you relating to the medicine? Are you opening up to the medicine? Are you struggling with the medicine? Are you learning your lessons? Are you integrating your lessons? How do you prepare for non-ordinary states of consciousness? How do you work with them depending on where you end up? If you end up anxious or overwhelmed or blissed out, if you end up kind of out of body or deeply embodied, the guide's going to be looking at all this kind of stuff. And depending on, their skill set and your needs and what your agreements with them are, going to be kind of directing and working with that to help you, let's say, customize and steer your experience in a particular direction. My experience with guided work is, I'll be honest here, complicated. I have a lot of respect for guided work as an art form and as a skill set. I think it is profoundly beautiful. I think it is profoundly deep and rich and can be very complex and nuanced and amazing. Some of my earliest powerful psychedelic experiences involved guide work that was transformative at the deepest level and supported me to have like profound spiritual breakthroughs. So I know it's deeply valuable work. At the same time, there are a lot of guides out there who really are more creating a nice setting for you to have a nice experience, but aren't doing a whole lot in terms of actually working with you, but are more just, hoping that the medicine does the work for you, or that your relationship with the medicine does the work, which sometimes totally pans out. And other times, really isn't, enough to get us to heal or shift the thing that we need to heal or shift. Especially those of us that are wanting to do psychedelics for perhaps trauma work, clear psychological issues, So if we are like, I've got this hang up and I want to get over it, or I'm, stuck in this, phase of my life and I need to move forward, or these kinds of things. I'm not always so sure that guide work is the best choice for that kind of stuff. But this, that's just my opinion. A lot of people out there, and perhaps you as a watcher will leave a comment and totally disagree with me and be like, no, guide work changed my life, or I am a guide and we absolutely do that kind of work, this kind of thing. So I don't want to poo-poo this. I don't want to disrespect anyone who does this work, because I think it's amazing. I think it's so beautiful. But I do think that sometimes guides kind of are like over advertise or oversell their capabilities, and really rely heavily on the medicine to do the work, and don't always actually know what they're doing all that much. And then some of them really know what they're doing and are gonna be that cross-trained person who knows how to do all of this shit really well. That might be more well-rounded than a traditional shaman, and more well-rounded than like a therapist who's kind of new to psychedelics and maybe very skilled at therapy, but not yet fully actualizing how to intersect between psychedelics and therapy. So guides certainly have their place. And I think that while it's true that they have the widest spread of skills, and while it's also true that they are an underground thing for the most part, like there are above ground guide trainings, but generally speaking, this has been traditionally an underground thing, and so therefore there's no kind of like metrics on what makes you a good guide, and it's more of like a word of mouth tradition kind of thing. I do think that the best of the best from the guide work probably are some of the best of the best at working with psychedelics in general. So it's kind of a wider palette there. So that's kind of my understanding of all of these. Let me just sum this up really quick for you guys, and then we'll kind of wrap the video. Okay, so just to recap really quick, we've got psychedelic therapists who are generally going to be highly trained, actual working therapists who understand a lot about the nuances of the psyche and how to work with people, probably have at least one solid skill set in terms of therapeutic modality, if not multiple. But the downside to therapists is often that they have a bias in their worldview and their skill set. And a lot of times they have to keep it extra hush-hush because they are working underground and can lose their license. A lot of times therapists actually have less experience with psychedelics and aren't always really clear on how to work with people in non-ordinary states of consciousness. Then we also have at the other end of the spectrum, shamans who are often experts at working in non-ordinary states. This is really their kind of forte, their training, their skill set. Often shamans are super badass and heavily, deeply trained, but they also come from a traditional background. They may not have as elegant of maps of understanding when it comes to the mind and emotions and psyche. They, sometimes may not always have the same ethical guidelines that a therapist would, so that can lead to some fuzzy interactions, shall we say. And shamans are very much working at the spiritual level with people. For some of you, that's going to be exactly what you need. For others, that's really not going to be the right fit for the issue you're wanting to work on. So keep that in mind. Kind of more in the middle, we have sitters, which are just really there to hold space, make sure we're safe, make sure that we're comfortable, but generally non-interactive. And then we have guides, which are really kind of this broadest range possible in terms of skill set, but also in terms of ways they interact, and from being highly interactive to not interactive much at all, from leveraging, perhaps shamanic approaches to using music, using scent, using environment, to a more therapeutic approach where perhaps some guides really understand certain approaches to therapy and might employ that in how they guide you. So consider all of that and do with that information what you will. So if you're looking for some sort of structured psychedelic, experience that you're led through, these are some of the options that are going to be available in terms of roles to you. I do think it's worth really getting a clear track on and really pursuing someone who clearly understands what their role is, if it's any of these roles. so that you can just trust that you're in the right hands for what it is that you need. So I hope that this clarifies this all for you. If you have any questions, do of course leave a comment down below, leave questions down below. If you liked something I said, if you disagree with something that I said, I absolutely welcome your feedback, your input. Leave comments, give a thumbs up, subscribe if you're new to the channel and you like this video, you want the algorithm to share it with other people. And that's all for now. I have more content on the way. Much love to you guys. Hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you soon.